Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into the dim, smoky quiet of the medieval world, where nothing moved quickly, nothing smelled particularly pleasant, and everyone drank things that today would be classified as questionable at best. So if you're settling in, dimming the lights, letting your shoulders relax a little, good. That's exactly the spirit. We're not here to learn anything urgent. We're not here to fix the past. We're simply here to wander through it, slowly, like someone who's accidentally walked into the wrong century and decided not to make a fuss about it. And tonight, we're beginning somewhere especially cozy, the Medieval Tavern. Or at least, the medieval version of cozy, a place with rough benches, sticky floors, and ale that tasted like it had survived 2 previous reincarnations. But people went anyway. Because, of course, they did. Humans have always gathered anywhere that served warm drinks and tolerated mildly unhinged conversations. Even in the 12th century. If you were a traveler inching your way along a muddy medieval road, the tavern wasn't just a place to stop, it was a sanctuary of sorts. Not a particularly clean one, or a quiet one, or one that wouldn't occasionally erupt into a low-energy brawl conducted mostly out of boredom, but still, a sanctuary. You'd push open the heavy wooden door, feel that familiar wave of warm, slightly suspicious-smelling air, and hope, gently, optimistically, that no one was arguing about whose turn it was to mend the village fence. Again. Inside, the darkness would wrap around you like a thick blanket someone forgot to wash. Only a few candles flickered somewhere in the corner, struggling to illuminate the room, as though they were also very tired from being alive in the Middle Ages. There'd be a hearth, usually. The fire wouldn't be cheerful, it would be the kind of fire that crackled like it was disappointed in its own existence. But at least it gave light. And warmth. And the strange comfort of knowing smoke was constantly doing its best to escape through a hole in the roof. Furniture was present. That's about all we can confidently say. Tables were uneven, like someone had just discovered the concept of flat surfaces, and wasn't fully committed to it. Benches were long and narrow and designed with zero concern for the human spine, which is probably why medieval people developed such sturdy attitudes. When your seat is trying to eject you every 3 minutes, you learn not to complain about other things. Let's drift over to the drinks, not because they were good, but because they were necessary. Water, in many places, wasn't exactly trustworthy. And by not trustworthy, I mean it wanted you dead. So people turned to ale. Weak ale for everyday life, strong ale for celebrations, and what we might call experimental ale for days when someone forgot that hops exist. Medieval ale didn't keep well. It had to be consumed quickly. Medically quickly. If you hesitated too long, the ale developed a personality, and not a pleasant one. If you were a wealthy traveler, you might ask for wine. But even that came with risks. Medieval wine could be sweet, sour, gritty, or suspiciously thick. Sometimes all at once. People accepted this because they didn't have the emotional energy to argue with their beverages. And then there was food. Oh yes. The tavern menu. A masterpiece of culinary effort. You'd get stews that had been simmering for so long they'd emotionally bonded with the pot. Bread that doubled as a blunt weapon. Meat pies that contained meat, or at least something with protein. Nobody asked too many questions. It was the Middle Ages. If it was warm and didn't move, you ate it. But the real value of a medieval tavern wasn't the food or the drink. It was the atmosphere. All those whispered stories, the shared exhaustion, the soft glow of firelight reflecting off pewter cups. Travelers traded news from distant towns, which spread slowly and unreliably, like a medieval version of social media but with way more farm animals involved. People gathered to hear the latest gossip from the noble courts, usually involving someone marrying their second cousin to secure land that no one actually wanted. Because that was medieval politics. Like a family reunion that never ended and also determined the fate of entire nations. And speaking of nobles, we will meander towards them very soon. Because nothing sets the sleepy mood quite like strolling into the strange personal habits of Europe's elite, who ruled vast territories while possessing absolutely no interest in basic hygiene or emotional stability. But before we drift toward royal oddities, let's stay in the tavern just a little longer. You'd notice the locals, sitting close together, hunched over their drinks like they were guarding state secrets. They weren't. They were discussing bread prices, or whose sheep had wandered into someone else's garden again. But they discussed these things with the seriousness of diplomats, because daily inconveniences were the backbone of community life. Sometimes, a traveling musician wandered in, a lute player with 3 working strings and an ambitious sense of confidence. Their music wasn't particularly good, but medieval people were very reasonable about entertainment. If it made noise and wasn't threatening, it counted as music. Songs drifted through the tavern about battles no one present had fought, queens no one had seen, and moral lessons everyone ignored. Every now and then, someone would say something outrageous, like claiming they had seen a fox that walked upright or a knight who actually paid his taxes. Everyone would laugh softly, mostly because they were too tired to laugh loudly. Then the conversation would settle back into its usual rhythm, like the gentle hum of a beehive, but with more coughing. By the way, if you're still awake, you might want to tell me in the comments. Would you ever visit a medieval tavern, or would you quietly turn around the moment you smelled the door? I'm curious to know which side of the spectrum you fall on. Now let's drift gently out of the tavern and move, slowly, lazily, into the wider medieval world. Because taverns weren't the only places people gathered. There were markets, noisy and chaotic, where chickens outranked half the customers in terms of confidence. There were churches, where sermons were long and seating options aggressively unforgiving. And then, of course, there were castles. The homes of Europe's finest dysfunctional dynasties. Ah yes, the nobles. The reason half of medieval Europe needed taverns in the first place. Noble families lived in stone fortresses that were impressive from the outside and impressively cold from the inside. The walls were thick, because everyone was constantly worried someone would attack them, usually because someone had. Kings and dukes had the unfortunate habit of offending one another by existing. A simple greeting could spark a war if delivered in the wrong tone. That's the kind of diplomatic environment we're dealing with. And while peasants warmed themselves around a hearth, nobles shivered in drafty halls large enough to echo their own bad decisions. The tapestries were pretty, though. At least they helped visually distract from the fact that the average medieval castle had the insulation of a hollow turnip. As we wander deeper into these noble households, we start encountering the kinds of family issues that would make modern therapists open a new notebook out of alarm. Marriages were strategic, affection was accidental, and heirs were essential. Preferably male, healthy, and not prone to picking up swords and running in circles like overly enthusiastic ducklings. But we'll unravel those stories slowly, very slowly, across the next parts of this long, sleepy journey. If you lived in medieval times, do you think you'd be a tavern regular, or more of a stay home and avoid people who drink warm ale type? Tell me in the comments, whenever you're awake enough. And as we drift onward from the tavern's low, smoky glow, we find ourselves stepping into the hazy daylight of the medieval village. The light feels a little too bright at first, like the sun itself hasn't quite mastered subtlety, but the world around us settles into that familiar quiet rhythm. There's no rush here. Things simply happen when they happen, which is usually later than anyone planned. People rise with the sun because nothing else wakes them up, unless you count roosters, which technically do wake people, but more in the sense of startling them out of mild resentment. Medieval mornings had a softness to them, despite the uncomfortable bedding and the cold floors. Houses were small, smoky, and cluttered with the kind of everyday objects that today would qualify as museum pieces. A wooden spoon wasn't just a utensil. It was a lifetime commitment. A stool wasn't a piece of furniture. It was an heirloom, probably with a leg missing, but cherished anyway because someone's great-grandparent had once sat on it without falling off. People dressed slowly, because when your clothing is made of wool thick enough to act as emotional armor, there's no rushing the process. Garments came in 3 varieties: itchy, very itchy, and this feels like a punishment. Of course, the wealthy had fancier fabrics, but even their clothes had that underlying medieval mood, heavy, layered, and designed to make sure no one could move quickly enough to cause trouble. As villagers stepped outside, the world greeted them with the same familiar smells: damp earth, wood smoke, livestock, and the faint but constant scent of people working very hard and bathing very rarely. Life was physical. Everything involved lifting, hauling, or coaxing uncooperative animals into cooperating for at least 10 seconds. Fields stretched outward, quiet and resigned, waiting for someone to turn the soil or mutter encouragingly at the crops. Farming was less of a profession and more of a never-ending conversation with nature, where nature listened politely and then did whatever it wanted anyway. And yet, despite all of the difficulty and mild chaos, medieval communities had their own gentle charm. People knew each other. They had no choice, really. When your entire social world consists of a few dozen households, Anonymity isn't an option. If you borrowed a tool, everyone knew. If you returned it, everyone celebrated. If you forgot, well, the blacksmith would casually ask about it every single day until you remembered out of pure psychological exhaustion. Families were large, mostly because children doubled as workforce and partly because medieval life treated longevity like an optional upgrade pack. Childhood was short, but not unkind. Kids played with sticks, rocks, and each other, usually with equal enthusiasm. There were no toys designed for enrichment, unless you count a hoop or whatever the goat dropped. But laughter echoed through villages anyway, because children have an impressive talent for entertaining themselves with absolutely nothing. Let's drift from the village center to the manor, the local lord's residence, which was essentially the medieval version of upper-middle-class existence. Not royalty, but royalty adjacent, like someone who knows a famous person's cousin and talks about it constantly. The manor had its own hierarchy, of course. Everyone needed to know their role, because confusion was the medieval enemy of order. If you weren't sure who was in charge, someone would gently remind you by giving you more work. The lord himself was often a man of questionable organization and unquestionable authority. He lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. His meals were larger, his clothes were finer, and his bed was slightly less straw-like than everyone else's, but he still lived in a drafty hall that echoed every time he breathed too deeply. Meals in the manor were ceremonious in the way only medieval meals could be, equal parts solemnity and, please don't spill anything on the tapestries. Everyone sat in strict order, because social hierarchy mattered even during dinner. Bread trenchers served as plates, absorbing the juices of whatever meat was available, which later would be given to the poor or tossed to the dogs, depending on how much the lord cared about public relations that week. Let's float from there into the small miracles of medieval craftsmanship. The tanner bending over leather. The potter shaping clay with hands that remembered every cup they'd ever made. The weaver sitting at a loom that clacked like it was counting down the hours until freedom. Work was repetitive, almost meditative. Quiet. Dependable. People found comfort in the rhythm, the way one day blended softly into the next, like a long exhale stretched over years. Markets broke the monotony occasionally, though they brought their own overwhelming energy. Wooden stalls filled with vegetables, linens, leather goods, and the occasional object no one could identify but everyone pretended to understand. "Ah yes," someone would say, picking up a mysterious tool, "very fine craftsmanship." And the merchant would nod confidently, both of them mutually agreeing not to question anything further. Animals roamed through markets as if they owned shares in the property. Chickens strutted with arrogant self-importance. Dogs lingered around every stall, flawlessly executing their lifelong mission of begging. Pigs wandered freely with a determination that implied they had business appointments. Now, as the village hums quietly, let's wander into the realm of religion, the gentle center of medieval life. Churches were more than buildings. They were spiritual hubs, community halls, event venues, legal offices, and the medieval version of a weekly news broadcast. People gathered there to hear sermons that lasted longer than necessary and contained more moral cautionary tales than anyone asked for. Monks drifted through their routines with serene dedication, rising at hours most people would classify as unholy. Their days were structured, peaceful, and filled with chants that echoed through stone cloisters. If villages were the heartbeat of medieval life, monasteries were the lungs, breathing quietly, rhythmically, with a calm that settled over everything nearby. And yet, even monasteries had their quirks. Some monks specialized in illuminating manuscripts, painting tiny golden leaves onto pages with a level of patience bordering on supernatural. Others brewed beer that became the talk of the region. Some tended gardens that would make modern herbalists weep with envy. Not all monks lived saintly lives, because naturally, even holy men could be dramatically human, but we'll drift into their scandals another time. Now, we slowly shift our attention upward, to the nobility and the royal courts, where chaos was less predictable but much better documented. Royal courts were stiff, glittering, uncomfortable places where fashion changed faster than hygiene habits ever would. Kings and queens sat on elaborate thrones that were mostly just large, uncomfortable chairs designed to remind everyone who was in charge. Courtiers bowed and scraped and whispered behind embroidered sleeves, half in awe and half in fear of being noticed by the wrong person on the wrong day. And royalty, well, royalty had habits. The kind of habits that make you tilt your head and wonder how entire continents were shaped by people who struggled to put on their own stockings. Many kings had tempers. Slow-building tempers that erupted in quiet, inconvenient ways, like demanding an entire meal be remade because a carrot looked at them oddly. Queens often had their own frustrations, especially those shuffled into political marriages with men they met only moments before the priest declared them legally miserable. Royal families fought constantly, not out of malice but out of tradition. Disagreement was the royal pastime. Succession crises were an annual event, like harvest season but with fewer vegetables and more swords. Take, for example, the medieval obsession with heirs. Every king wanted sons. Healthy sons. Preferably several, just in case one fell off a horse or developed the medieval illness known as being too enthusiastic during a joust. Daughters were welcome too, if they married strategically, quietly, and preferably to someone who would not cause future wars. Though, naturally, they usually did. And then there was royal childhood. Royal children were raised with tutors, wet nurses, etiquette lessons, and absolutely no genuine parental affection. Their toys were miniature weapons and symbolic trinkets. Their friendships were monitored for political implications. Their futures were decided before their first teeth appeared. If a modern therapist ever time-traveled into a medieval court, they would simply sit down and start crying. Royal food was abundant, but not necessarily good. Too much spice, too much salt, too many dishes served for the sake of status rather than flavor. Meals dragged on for hours, accompanied by music no one wanted and conversations no one dared to end. When the king rose, everyone sighed in relief. Internally, of course. Let's drift slightly closer to daily palace life. Servants moved through corridors like shadows, efficient and invisible. They knew every scandal, every whispered argument, every item that mysteriously went missing from the treasury and reappeared weeks later in the possession of someone claiming they found it lying around. And kings? Well, kings had hobbies. Some hunted obsessively. Some prayed obsessively. Some collected oddities, exotic animals, rare books, or decorative objects that served no purpose other than making guests politely ask, "What is that supposed to be?" Now, after all this wandering, let's offer a gentle question for the comments. If you had to choose, would you live as a medieval villager with simple routines, or as a noble trapped in a cold stone castle with uncomfortable furniture and constant family drama? Let me know, quietly, whenever you're awake enough. As we drift onward from the cold stone corridors of the medieval castle, let's wander slowly, very slowly, into the wider medieval world again, this time through the eyes of the weary traveler. Because medieval travel wasn't a hobby. It was an ordeal. A slow-motion endurance test conducted on roads that appeared to have been designed by someone who disliked the concept of roads. When a medieval traveler set out, they did it with the resigned determination of a person who knew they were about to spend several days apologizing to their own knees. There were no smooth cobblestones except in cities, and even those were more optimistically flat than truly even. Roads were dirt, mud, and occasionally just a philosophical suggestion of where other people had walked before. If you were wealthy, you traveled on horseback. If you weren't wealthy, you walked while hoping your shoes held out longer than your patience. And if you were extremely unlucky, you traveled with a cart, because carts were slow, loud, and prone to breaking whenever you needed them most, like a medieval cousin of modern printers. Travelers stopped at inns when available, but these inns varied wildly in quality. Some were clean enough to make you sigh with relief. Others were the sort of establishment where you walked through the door, looked around, and immediately reconsidered every life choice that led you there. Shared straw bedding, drafty walls, and occasional rodents with strong opinions were common features. The medieval rating system was simple. If you left the inn with the same number of belongings and the same number of limbs, it was considered a success. Traveling merchants made these journeys constantly. They trudged from village to village, selling cloth, spices, trinkets, and occasionally items so useless that even medieval villagers, who reused everything except oxygen, couldn't find a purpose for them. Merchants were the medieval news network, carrying stories, rumors, and updates from distant regions with the same accuracy one might expect from a very enthusiastic but unreliable cousin. Knights traveled too, though their journeys were more dramatic. They rode with banners fluttering, armor clanking, and a deep-seated belief that the world respected them more than it actually did. Armor looked impressive, of course. It gleamed in sunlight. It conveyed authority. It also weighed as much as an enthusiastic pig and made mounting a horse a small comedy show in itself. But despite the hardships, travel connected medieval society. Ideas spread. Goods moved. Gossip flourished. And kings, of course, relied on all this movement to maintain control. Or at least the illusion of control. And speaking of kings, let's drift back into their world, the strange, shimmering bubble where power, ego, and questionable decision-making collided with remarkable frequency. Royalty liked to travel too, but they did it on a much more inconvenient scale. A royal progress wasn't just a king going for a walk. It was an entire household uprooting itself and moving across the countryside like a very slow, very disorganized parade. Hundreds of people. Dozens of wagons. Piles of tapestries. A portable kitchen. And the king, sitting atop a horse like someone performing the medieval version of "I swear I'm approachable." Villagers along the path were expected to provide food, lodging, and general hospitality, whether they could afford to or not. Imagine waking up, stepping outside, and realizing the king and his royal entourage were on their way to your house, and you had 20 minutes to make everything look presentable. Medieval stress was built different. And yet kings enjoyed these progresses. They allowed rulers to display power, gather support, hear complaints, and pretend like they were deeply connected to their people even while wearing clothes worth more than an entire village. People bowed, cheered, and offered gifts because not offering gifts tended to have consequences. Once the king arrived at a noble's estate, the host had to provide a feast, no matter the cost. Medieval nobles bankrupted themselves regularly trying to impress kings who, frankly, were impossible to impress. If the king declared the meal satisfactory, the host celebrated like they had won a small war. Royal travel wasn't just a show. It was part of a broader medieval truth. Kings needed constant legitimacy. Armies, coins, ceremonies, church blessings. These were all reminders to the world that the king was, in fact, the king. Because the moment people started questioning that, trouble brewed. And medieval trouble brewed quickly. Let's drift now into the bitter, dramatic, yet somehow still sleepy world of medieval succession, the art of trying to pass down the crown without starting a decades-long argument. Spoiler: they rarely succeeded. Kings wanted heirs. Preferably many. Preferably healthy. But medieval life being what it was, royal families often consisted of one sickly prince, two anxious princesses, and an assortment of distant cousins peering at the throne like it was a pie cooling on a windowsill. When a king died, everyone panicked politely. Nobles whispered. Foreign rulers watched with interest. Brothers plotted. Uncles prepared persuasive speeches, or armies. The church tried to maintain calm while secretly taking notes in case they needed to excommunicate someone later. Take, for instance, the classic medieval scenario. The king had 3 sons. The eldest was serious and dull, the second was charming and irresponsible, and the third was highly intelligent but sickly. Everyone knew the eldest would inherit. Everyone also knew the eldest would ruin everything by trying too hard. And naturally, the second son would stir trouble out of boredom. And the third would die tragically early after contributing several meaningful sentences to world history. And yet kingdoms survived. Somehow. Let's drift a little closer to individual rulers, their quirks, their habits, their extremely questionable judgment calls. Because this is where medieval history becomes both fascinating and deeply sleepy in that "I can't believe this shaped the world" sort of way. Some kings were obsessed with hunting. They spent days riding through forests, chasing deer, boars, or whatever moved slightly too fast near them. Hunting wasn't really about food. It was about showing dominance over nature, the animal kingdom, and sometimes their own knights, who had to keep up or die trying. Kings returned muddy, proud, and usually injured, and everyone at court pretended this was very impressive. Other kings preferred books. They collected manuscripts, studied philosophy, and hosted debates that lasted for hours and resolved nothing. These kings were usually nicknamed the Wise, although many seemed wise mostly because they didn't start wars as often as everyone else. Some kings were devoutly religious. They prayed for hours, fasted often, and commissioned churches, and then immediately went to war with someone because medieval piety was surprisingly flexible. A few kings were eccentric in ways that deserved gentle raised eyebrows. One spent an entire year refusing to speak to anyone except his pet. Another insisted his meals revolve around a single color each day, turning dinner into a surreal art project with unfortunate gastrointestinal consequences. Yet another king believed he had been turned into glass, prompting his servants to cushion every piece of furniture in the castle. And then there were queens, steadfast, sharp, politically savvy, and almost always underappreciated. Queens held influence behind the scenes, managing alliances, marriages, and the king's occasional emotional meltdowns. They navigated politics like skilled chess players while publicly pretending they were interested only in embroidery. Their lives were a quiet performance of grace, control, and strategic patience. Princesses were bargaining chips, traded through marriage to secure peace or land or an alliance that would fall apart within 5 years anyway. Their lives were wrapped in silk, etiquette, and the ever-present pressure to produce heirs for men they met moments before being told to smile. Some princesses rebelled subtly, choosing unfashionable colors, refusing to flirt with ambassadors, or learning languages no one expected them to learn. Others embraced their roles with practiced serenity. Princes, meanwhile, were trained from birth to rule, but rarely trained to function emotionally. They learned Latin, heraldry, theology, and how to glare meaningfully across banquet halls. But they received no guidance on how to process feelings, which is why many medieval conflicts began when a prince woke up irritated. Let's drift away from royalty now and into the courts, the places where political ambition simmered beneath layers of velvet and ceremony. Courtiers dressed extravagantly, bowed frequently, and gossiped constantly. Their entire existence revolved around being noticed by the right people and ignored by the wrong ones. They flattered kings with alarming enthusiasm, saying things like, "Your Majesty, your new boots bring out the nobility of your stride." This was king speak for, "Please don't banish me." Every court had rivals, factions quietly scheming behind tapestries. Alliances shifted with the wind. A misplaced comment could end a career. A well-placed compliment could elevate someone to unexpected power. One day a courtier was shining boots. The next day he was advising the king on foreign policy. No one questioned this. Medieval meritocracy was flexible. And yet, despite all the scheming, the court also had its slower, softer rhythms. Musicians played predictable melodies. Servants polished identical objects. Scribes copied documents with patient resentment. At night, the court fell into a hush broken only by footsteps, distant prayers, or the unmistakable sound of someone trying, and failing, to latch a heavy wooden door quietly. Now, before we drift toward the next section in Part 4, here's a gentle little question for the comments. If you had lived in medieval times, would you have wanted to be a traveler exploring strange lands, or would you prefer staying home, knowing exactly which goat belonged to which neighbor? No rush to answer. Maybe think about it when you're drifting to sleep. And with that, we float softly onward. As dawn slowly lifted over the horizon, the world seemed to exhale, a long, quiet breath that softened every edge of the landscape. The faint memory of twilight still clung to the sky, blending gentle shades of lavender and pale blue into a gradient so delicate it felt like it could dissolve with a single careless blink. Birds stirred invisibly in the treetops, offering half-awake chirps, the kind that sound more like questions than songs. And as the early light stretched its way across the terrain, it brushed over stone, over wood, over fields that had known centuries, and woke them with a slow, deliberate tenderness. If you've been listening from the earlier chapters, then you may already sense the rhythm of these old places, this quiet pulse that seems to echo through long-forgotten paths and ruins. One of the comforting things about history is that it doesn't rush. It waits. And here, in this soft morning hush, you can let it wash over you once again. For today, we wander deeper into the landscapes shaped by countless hands before ours. Landscapes where empires rose, dreams crumbled, and ordinary people lived lives we often underestimate. Yet their small decisions shaped extraordinary chapters of the world. And perhaps, as you ease into this moment, you may find yourself sinking gently into the story, drifting like someone floating along a slow-moving river. There's no urgency here, no pressure, only time, stretching in all directions. The forgotten road of silver traders. Our journey this night, or morning, depending on when you're listening, leads us onto an ancient trade road. It wasn't famous like the Silk Road, nor lavish like the royal highways of Persia. But to the people who walked it, it was the spine of their livelihoods. A narrow, winding route carved through rocky hills, stitched into the landscape like a thin gray thread. Imagine the traders who traveled here centuries ago. Most carried only small sacks of silver or hand-forged tools. Their stories were quiet ones. They didn't discover new continents or launch rebellions. They simply walked this road, day after day, year after year, their boots pressing into the same soft dust we imagine beneath our own steps. You might picture a trader from the 12th century, his cloak patched many times over. The hood slips down his back as the wind brushes along the mountain ridges. His mule walks patiently behind, hooves tapping gently like a slow heartbeat. Each step creates a small puff of dust, rising, drifting, fading away before it ever reaches the height of his shoulders. He knew every curve of this road the way you know the shape of your own room in the dark. He had no map, no compass, but he didn't need them, because the mountains themselves were guides. The bend where the wind changed direction. The cliff edge where echoes sounded different. The worn stone where thousands of travelers before him had left their invisible footprints. And even though centuries have passed, the essence of that road still lingers in the air. If you close your eyes, maybe you can imagine it. Cool morning air, slow footsteps, and the rustling of old coins tied at someone's belt. These small histories, quiet histories, have a way of easing the mind. Because while textbooks rush to describe wars, thrones, and kings, there were far more ordinary lives, steady, unhurried, full of simple routines. And sometimes those stories are exactly what we need to fall into a peaceful drift. A village frozen in time. Eventually the trade road curved downward, sloping into a valley. This valley cradled a village that seemed perfectly content to exist outside the urgency of the world. Imagine approaching it slowly. The rooftops appear first, soft brown thatch warmed by early sunlight. Smoke rises lazily from a single chimney, curling upward like a cat stretching after sleep. There is no bustling marketplace, no shouting, no clatter of carts yet. Only stillness. A small wooden fence surrounds the homes, not to keep anything out, but simply to define a place where people lived together. The air holds that faint morning scent, dew on soil, wood ash from last night's fire, and the earthy sweetness of bread dough left to rise. If you were to wander inside, you'd find a baker kneading quietly, sleeves rolled to her elbows, humming a melody she learned as a child. It's a song without words, simple and repetitive, perhaps something her mother sang long before she ever knew she would be a baker herself. Down the path, a shepherd wraps a woolen shawl around his shoulders, stepping outside before fully awake. His sheep gather around him like soft white clouds, waiting. They are patient creatures, and in this early hour, they look almost like shapes painted into the landscape rather than living animals. The shepherd walks slowly, giving the mind plenty of space to drift. His staff taps rhythmically against the ground, a sound neither loud nor sharp, just enough to keep rhythm with breathing. Even the sun seems reluctant to rush, stretching rays across the rooftops one by one, like fingers brushing dust from old furniture. If you listen closely, you might hear the distant sound of a watermill turning. Its wooden paddles dip into the slow-moving stream, pushing and lifting, in the same steady pattern they've followed for generations. The wooden wheel groans quietly, as though clearing its throat from a long night. Nothing here is in a hurry, and neither are you. The stone bridge of quiet echoes. Past the village lies something remarkable, not because it is grand, but because it has survived so impossibly long. A stone bridge, narrow and gently arched, crosses the river that feeds the valley. Built long before the village existed, it endured storms, floods, invasions, and centuries of footsteps. Its stones are uneven, smoothed by time. Moss grows along the edges like soft green velvet, especially on the shaded side. But what makes the bridge special is not its age, nor its architecture. It's the echoes. Stand on its center and speak softly, and the sound will bounce back to you not once, but twice. A double echo, so faint you might mistake it for an illusion. But the villagers believed the bridge remembered voices. That each echo was a remnant of someone who had once crossed the stones long ago. A legend said that if you stood on the bridge at twilight and whispered your hopes into the air, the stones would carry them across the water and deliver them to tomorrow. What a peaceful idea! Hopes gently carried into a new day, resting in the hands of something older and steadier than any of us. Try to picture the way the river flows beneath it. Not hurried, not roaring, simply drifting, like a long ribbon of glass. Pebbles shimmer below the surface. Every now and then, a silver fish darts through shadow, leaving ripples behind. If you lean your elbows on the stone railing, cool, smooth, almost comforting, you could stay there a while. Listening, breathing, letting the water's rhythm quiet the thoughts that try too hard to be loud. The ancient world was full of places like this, small, simple spaces where nothing dramatic happened, yet where the weight of time felt soft, not heavy. Across the plains of whispering grass. Leaving the bridge and continuing onward, the valley gradually flattens into a wide, open plain. Fields stretch in every direction. Some are golden, some green, some left fallow to rest, dotted with tiny wildflowers. But what makes these plains memorable is the wind. It moves the grass in waves, like an ocean frozen into blades and stems. Each gust sweeps gently, bending the grass in soft arcs. When many patches sway together, they create the illusion of whispers, small, rustling murmurs rolling across the land. Ancient travelers claimed that this plain was home to spirits. Not dangerous ones, but gentle guardians of long journeys. They believed the whispers were encouragement, urging them forward, promising that rest awaited beyond the horizon. Imagine walking through that sea of grass. The stalks brush against your ankles. The wind strokes your hair. You can breathe deeply, without the scent of smoke or the pressure of walls. The plains remind you that the world is vast, that you are small but safe, wandering a path walked by thousands long before. Sometimes, when ancient soldiers marched through these fields, the wind erased their footsteps almost instantly. And many found comfort in that, knowing that the earth did not hold grudges. Whatever burdens they carried, the plains never kept them. Peace isn't always found in silence. Sometimes it's found in places where nature speaks in soft, continuous murmurs. And here, on these whispering plains, you can rest your mind for a moment, letting the sound of grass become the sound of your own breath. A hermit's sanctuary on the hill. As the road curves again, you spot a hill rising gently above the plain. Not steep, not sharp, just tall enough to overlook the world with quiet authority. On its slope stands a small stone structure, barely large enough for one person. For centuries, hermits lived here one after another. Not monks belonging to grand orders. Not prophets seeking attention. Just individuals who wanted a little space from the noise of life. Inside the structure, there is nothing but a small bed of straw, a hand-carved wooden bowl, a candle holder built from river stones, and a window facing the sunrise. The walls are rough stone, cool to the touch. But the window glows warm each morning, lighting the interior with soft gold. Imagine the hermit sitting cross-legged near that window, fingers wrapped around a clay cup of warm herbs. His beard long, his clothes plain, his eyes gentle. Not lost, not lonely, simply content. He would spend hours listening to the wind. Not analyzing it, not writing about it. Just listening. When travelers climbed the hill seeking wisdom, he offered very little advice. Instead, he invited them to sit, share silence, and watch the sunrise. Perhaps that was his wisdom. That clarity often arrives not through words, but through stillness. Sometimes, it's comforting to reflect on lives devoted to simplicity. Lives without noise, deadlines, or expectations. Lives where quiet was not just an absence of sound, but a companion. And as you imagine that calm sanctuary, perhaps it becomes easier to let your own thoughts settle, like dust drifting gently onto a table. The distant glow of an ancient city. Far beyond the hill, the plains end, and a faint shape rises on the horizon. An ancient city. Not a metropolis with grand walls or towering gates, but a city that once thrived, its streets filled with artisans, scholars, travelers, farmers, musicians, and dreamers. From afar, you see only outlines, the faint geometry of rooftops, the distant glimmer of sunlight on clay tiles, the suggestion of towers worn down by time. Approaching the city feels like approaching a memory. The outer buildings are faded, almost blending into the color of the plains. Windows stand open, curtains drifting softly. A stray cat might slink through an alley, disappearing behind stacked pottery jars. Inside these streets, history lingers like perfume, faint, delicate, and sweet. Stories float between courtyards. Laughter from a century ago might still echo faintly if you close your eyes. Imagine walking down a narrow street lined with old stone houses. The walls are cool, the shadows long, the air carrying a mix of spices, bread, and ancient dust. Somewhere nearby, a musician plays a simple flute tune, slow, rhythmic, wandering like a river. The melody doesn't demand emotion. It simply exists, wrapping itself around the corners of the street and resting gently on your shoulders. And as you walk, the world seems to slow. Your heartbeat steadies. Your breathing deepens. You feel the weight of centuries settle around you, not as pressure, but as a soft blanket. Because ancient cities remind us that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves. The ancient city, quiet and half asleep under the gentle rise of morning light, slowly gives way to deeper paths that pull us away from the marketplace streets and into the heart of forgotten stories. And as we wander deeper, the air grows cooler, as if every step pulls us into layers of time stacked upon one another like pages in a book left open on a windowsill. There's something peaceful about cities that have outlived their noise. They are still full of memories, but the memories no longer shout. They whisper. They hum. They float like dust motes drifting in sunlight. And so, as this chapter begins, feel free to settle a bit more into your pillow or your chair. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop. This is a gentle walk, one without pressure, one without deadlines. Just stories, drifting like soft wind. The library with no name. Near the city's eastern quarter lies a building many travelers never noticed at all. Its exterior is so plain, just smooth sandstone, worn by centuries of weather, that it blends quietly into the row of homes around it. There is no sign, no carved symbol, no guard at the door. Yet this unassuming place once housed one of the most quietly powerful collections of knowledge in the region. People called it the library with no name because it never needed one. Stepping inside, the air shifts noticeably. Cooler, drier, still. As though the world outside was somehow sealed off the moment you crossed the threshold. Shelves carved from dark wood stretch along the walls, filled not with bound books as we imagine today, but with scrolls, fragile, rolled, tied with thin strips of leather. Imagine unrolling one of those scrolls, the parchment crackling softly under your touch. The ink, faded to a soft brown, carries the careful handwriting of a scribe from long ago. Some scrolls record trade routes. Others hold medical remedies, astronomy notes, travel diaries, philosophical thoughts, or even simple observations about daily life. How villagers harvested olives, how children played in dusty streets, how fishermen predicted storms by watching the wings of seabirds. Knowledge in this place was not grand or dramatic. It was lived knowledge. Human knowledge. The kind collected slowly, gently, like rainwater in a clay jar. A caretaker once lived here, a man in his later years, with a voice so soft people leaned forward to hear him. He believed that every scroll, no matter how small its subject, mattered to someone. And perhaps it still does. Because when knowledge is preserved, even through centuries, it often waits for the right moment to be useful again. Sometimes, in the evenings, he sat at a wooden table near the center of the room, trimming damaged parchment with a tiny knife. The way he moved, carefully, deliberately, looked almost like a meditation, as if the library itself taught him to be slow. You might imagine sitting across from him, listening to the faint scratch of his knife or the gentle rustle of a scroll being repaired. It is a sound that can lull anyone into ease, like a slow lullaby hidden inside an ordinary task. In the library with no name, time felt different. Not fast or slow, just round. Continuous. Endless. Perhaps that's why stepping back outside feels like waking from a long, feather-soft dream. The garden of quiet conversations. Behind the library lies a small garden. Visitors often missed it entirely, as the narrow stone archway leading to it was nearly disguised by creeping vines. But beyond that arch was a world so serene it felt as though the air itself had softened. The garden was circular, bordered by ancient olive trees whose twisted trunks looked like frozen dancers in the middle of a graceful turn. Their leaves shimmered a gentle silver when touched by sunlight. And beneath them, carefully planted herbs, sage, pennyroyal, rosemary, lavender, released a fragrance that lingered in the air like soothing music. In the center of the garden sat a stone bench. Not polished, not ornate, just old, smooth, and welcoming. Here, for generations, philosophers, poets, and travelers came to talk. But not to debate, not to argue, not to impress. They came to share quiet conversations, ones spoken in the softer corners of the day, with no urgency and no goal other than to understand the world a little better. Imagine two scholars sitting there at sunset, the sky glowing amber behind the trees. One speaks about the stars, the other about moral dilemmas. They are not trying to win. They simply let their thoughts drift like petals falling from a flower. Sometimes they sit without speaking at all, letting silence fill the space between them like clear water filling a small pond. And occasionally, a traveler sits on the bench alone, their journey heavy, their mind swirling. But the garden does not demand answers. It only gives comfort. The scent of herbs, the rustle of olive leaves, the hum of faraway city sounds, it all weaves together into a blanket of calm. If you've ever needed a place to rest your thoughts without judgment, this garden would welcome you too. The Artisans' Quarter at midday. Leaving the garden, you wander through narrow alleys until the quiet gives way to soft activity. You've reached the Artisans' Quarter, a place where sunlight filters through linen canopies and the gentle tapping of tools forms a soothing, almost melodic rhythm. Even at its busiest, the quarter never felt chaotic. Each artisan moved with a calm precision that made the space feel like a living, breathing workshop of harmony. A potter sits at her wheel, hands steady as the clay rises and forms under her touch. The wheel hums softly, spinning like a slow echo of time itself. She dips her fingers into a bowl of water, shaping the vessel with a simple grace learned only through years of repetition. Next to her, a woodcarver chips away at a block of cedar. Each tap of his chisel is soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. A curl of wood falls, then another, forming a small pile of fragrant shavings that carry a warm, resinous scent. Nearby, a weaver adjusts the tension of her loom. Threads, dyed in earthy tones, stretch across the frame. The shuttle slides through them with a gentle swish, like wind brushing grass. Her work is slow, patient, meditative. Even the blacksmith, the loudest of them all, moves with surprising gentleness. His hammer rings out, yes, but not sharply. Each strike is controlled, precise, accompanied by the soft hiss of cooling metal. Sparks dance briefly, then vanish like tiny fireflies. There is something deeply calming about watching others labor with focus and purpose. It reminds us that for most of history, life was not hurried. Skills grew slowly, creations formed gradually, and satisfaction came from the journey as much as the result. In this quarter, the artisans didn't just make objects. They made peace. The old bathhouse of warm stone. Farther down the street stands a building made of smooth, rounded stone, darkened by centuries of steam. This is the old bathhouse, a place that once served the city not only as a place to wash, but as a sanctuary where minds unwound and burdens dissolved. Inside, light filters through small openings in the ceiling, creating soft beams that shift with the day's passing. Warm mist hangs in the air, wrapping around you like a gentle embrace. The floor is smooth under your feet, warmed by an underflow of heated water. Pools of various temperatures are arranged in a semicircle, some warm like a comforting hug, others cool like mountain springs. Imagine lowering yourself into one of the warm pools, the water enveloping you slowly. Your muscles loosen. Your breathing deepens. The world quiets. In ancient times, people came here not for luxury, but for stillness, for reflection, for connection. You might hear the soft splash of someone entering another pool, the quiet murmur of friends sharing stories, the gentle clink of clay cups filled with herbal infusions. A bathhouse attendant moves silently, adding fragrant oils to the water, perhaps rose, perhaps chamomile. The scent lifts into the air, soothing and delicate. The best part of this place is the silence, a living silence that melts into the stone walls and settles deep into your bones. Even now, imagining it, a tranquility spreads within you, like warm water flowing into spaces you didn't realize were tense. History remembers the wars, but it often forgets the peace people created for themselves in places like this. The Hall of Dust and Sunlight. Beyond the bathhouse stands a curious structure, long, narrow, and lined with tall pillars. Most people aren't quite sure what it once was. A council hall, a market shelter, a place of worship. Scholars argue, but the truth has been lost to time. What remains is a tranquil, sunlit passage. The pillars cast long shadows that shift with the sun, creating patterns on the stone floor like woven fabric. Birds sometimes perch on the tops, their quiet chirps echoing softly. Dust drifts lazily in the warm light, floating like tiny stars suspended in a golden sky. Walking through this hall is like stepping into another world. Footsteps sound different here, softer, muted, almost reverent. Some say the hall was once used for teaching. Others believe it was a refuge during storms. But everyone agrees it holds a strange, comforting calm. Standing here, you can place a hand on one of the pillars and feel the coolness of ancient stone. Not cold, not warm, just a steady, grounding temperature that feels like the earth itself resting its hand against yours. If the city were a human body, this hall would be its slow, steady breath. The city at dusk. As evening approaches, the ancient city shifts once more. Shadows lengthen. Air cools. Lamps flicker awake, their flames swaying gently in the early breeze. People begin to move toward the central square, drawn by the promise of quiet evening gatherings. Not festivals. Not markets. Just simple, nightly moments. A storyteller takes a seat on a low stool. Elders settle on cushions. Children lean sleepily against their parents. Merchants rest their tired legs. Travelers pause their journeys for a night. The storyteller's voice rises, soft, slow, melodic. He speaks not of heroes, but of small tales, a fisherman who rescued a bird, a farmer who found a lost child, a quiet friendship between an old scholar and a stray cat, stories of kindness, gentleness, shared humanity. The flames flicker. The sky deepens to purples and blues. Stars emerge one by one. And gradually, very gradually, the entire city seems to sink into a peaceful rhythm. A rhythm older than its stones. A rhythm that can lull even the most restless listener into calm. You can almost feel sleep brushing at the edges of your thoughts. Not urgent, not demanding, just gently inviting. As the last notes of the storyteller's voice fade into the evening air, the city settles into a deeper quiet, the kind that feels almost sacred. Lamps sway softly in the cooling breeze, casting warm halos around their flame-lit glass. And those wandering the streets begin to walk a little slower, as though the night itself thickens into something gentle and protective. It's in these quiet hours that we can drift onward to another corner of the medieval world, one that often went unnoticed during the bustle of the day, but came alive in its own hushed way once the sun dipped below the horizon. This is the district where the city's workers and wanderers found rest, comfort, and occasionally questionable company. The humble, slightly drafty, and surprisingly important medieval inn. Not the tavern this time. We've already drifted through that candlelit chaos. The inn is different. It lacks the rowdy laughter, the clatter of mugs, and the occasional argument about who insulted whose goat. The inn is quieter, sleepier, full of the soft sounds of travelers who were, much like you might be right now, half awake, half asleep, not entirely sure which world they were in. Walking toward the inn feels like approaching a resting heartbeat in the middle of the city. The roads are emptier now, but the stone beneath your feet still holds the warmth of the day. Windows glow faintly from the inside, revealing silhouettes of families preparing for bed or merchants tallying up coins for the day's final count. A dog trots across the road, pauses halfway, looks at you with mild suspicion, as medieval dogs always do, and decides you're not a threat. It continues on, leaving you to your wanderings, which is probably for the best. Matching wits with a medieval dog rarely ends in your favor. The inn sits at the crossroads of two old streets, its wooden beams darkened from decades of smoke drifting upward from its kitchen hearth. A small sign hangs on a rusted iron hook near the door. The paint has almost entirely flaked off, yet through sheer stubbornness, the sign continues to exist, creaking softly when the wind nips at it. Stepping inside is like being swallowed by warmth. The air smells of wood smoke, boiled grains, and the faint sweetness of honeyed ale. A few travelers sit hunched over low tables, not talking much, simply savoring the quiet after long days walking dusty roads. Their cloaks are hung on pegs by the door, dripping slowly if rain has been unkind that night. A dog, this one far less suspicious, lies sprawled by the fire, snoring gently in a way that suggests it hasn't moved since the last lunar cycle. The innkeeper, a middle-aged man with a face permanently set in the expression of someone who's seen too many spilled drinks and heard too many travelers complain about mattress straw, nods slightly as you enter. He doesn't speak. He rarely does at night. The nighttime hours require little conversation, only the subtle exchange of needs and comforts. A gesture, a nod, a bowl placed quietly on the table. People in medieval inns didn't expect luxury. They were satisfied if the straw was relatively fresh, the blankets didn't smell overwhelmingly of sheep, and the rats were polite enough to keep to the far corners of the room. And, believe it or not, many inns prided themselves on things as simple as clean wooden spoons or a fireplace that didn't smoke aggressively into your face. Tonight, the inn is calm, nearly silent. A candle burns low on a nearby table, the flame bending slightly toward you when the door closes behind you. Someone coughs softly in the corner. Someone else stirs in their sleep, shifting on a straw mattress probably purchased in the last 2 reigns of monarchs. Medieval bedding was less fresh and more resilient. You find a seat near the fire, where the warmth licks your shins in gentle waves. Medieval fires had a way of making everything feel timeless. They crackled slowly, as if hiding tiny stories in each pop of the logs. And as you sit there, letting the warmth seep up your legs, you can almost forget the long journey that brought you here. Travel was no small ordeal in those days. Roads twisted unpredictably. Weather shifted without warning. And bandits, well, they had terrible work ethics but excellent timing. So resting in an inn, even a humble one, felt like a blessing. A pause between uncertainties. A temporary refuge. You watch as the innkeeper ladles thick pottage into a traveler's bowl. It's a blend of vegetables simmered so long they've agreed to stop existing as individuals. Medieval cuisine often relied on the principle of throw everything in and pray for flavor. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes. The traveler accepts the bowl with a grateful nod, inhaling the steam with the caution of a man who has burned his tongue one too many times. It's a small moment, but one filled with the quiet contentment of survival and rest. Something deeply relatable even across centuries. Nearby, a group of merchants finish a quiet conversation. One rises slowly, joints crackling like old wood. He rubs his back with the weary resignation of someone who has carried far too many crates of cloth, spices, and possibly regret. His 2 companions follow him toward the stairs leading to the upper rooms, rooms that likely feature communal sleeping arrangements, uneven floors, and the subtle scent of damp wool. But they go gladly. They go because rest, even imperfect rest, is a treasure on the road. And perhaps, as you watch them climb the stairs, you start feeling your own eyelids grow a little heavier. The fire helps. Fires always help. They have a way of convincing the mind that time has slowed and the world can wait. The innkeeper returns, placing a cup near your hand. Something warm, maybe watered wine or spiced herbal infusion. Medieval beverages were rarely strong in inns at night. The goal was not merriment but sleep. And sleep, in these walls, often came easily, even to the restless. Let's drift, for a moment, to those sleeping quarters. The stairs creak underfoot, their boards worn smooth by generations of boots. The hallway above is dimly lit by a single lamp hanging from a wooden peg. Doors, some open, some closed, line the corridor unevenly, as though placed by a carpenter who believed measuring tools were optional suggestions. Inside each room, straw-stuffed mattresses lie on raised wooden platforms. Some rooms have 2 beds, some have 8, depending on how lucky or unlucky you were with your coin purse. Quilts, patched and faded, drape over the beds in a motley collection of colors that once resembled red or green or maybe blue decades ago. You might imagine lying down in such a room. The straw shifts beneath you with a gentle rustle. The quilt smells faintly of smoke, herbs, and the faint ghost of a sheep who definitely did not volunteer for this arrangement. But despite that, it's warm. It's safe. It's yours for the night. Through the thin wooden walls, you hear travelers murmuring in sleep. A quiet sigh. A dreamer turning. A child whispering to her mother that she's cold. Someone, somewhere, softly humming themselves into rest. It is imperfect. It is human. It is peacefully alive. As the night deepens, the city outside fades entirely. The footsteps, the market calls, the clatter of carts, all gone. Only the soft breathing of sleepers remains, rising and falling in a slow communal rhythm. And down below, the innkeeper extinguishes the last lamp, his footsteps echoing softly as he makes his way to his own small room near the kitchen. The dog near the hearth stretches, groans contentedly, and shifts into an even deeper sleep, the kind only medieval dogs could master. The inn settles. The world settles. And we settle with it, drifting from the quiet inn into the wider world again. Now, let's drift outward toward another thread of medieval life, one touched gently by superstition, half-truths, and a fair bit of imaginative creativity. Not the grand fantasies of kingdoms and dragons. Just small, everyday beliefs that shaped how people understood the world the way someone might interpret the shape of clouds. Take, for instance, medieval dream interpretation. People believed dreams carried messages. Some divine, some personal, some probably caused by spoiled barley. But they viewed dreams as small windows into truths they weren't ready or willing to see in daylight. Imagine lying in one of those straw-filled beds, drifting into sleep, and dreaming of a rooster standing on a roof. A medieval scholar might insist this meant you'd soon receive unexpected news. Or perhaps that someone nearby would try to deceive you. Or, if the scholar was feeling especially philosophical that day, he'd claim the rooster represented your inner struggle between pride and humility, which, given roosters' personalities, feels surprisingly accurate. Dream books, actual medieval dream guides, offered interpretations for everything from dreaming of fish, prosperity, to dreaming of shoes, journeys, to dreaming of bees, unexpected visitors, which may have been more literal than symbolic. Dreaming of cats. Well, that could mean anything from troublesome relationships to impending theft, depending entirely on the region and possibly the interpreter's feelings toward cats that morning. Dreaming of bread usually signaled abundance. Dreaming of a broken jug foretold misfortune. Dreaming of rain could predict sadness unless you happened to be a farmer, in which case it was probably the best news you'd hear all year. It sounds whimsical now, but in a world without constant noise and glowing screens, people paid closer attention to the quiet narratives of their minds. Dreams mattered, and in their dimly lit rooms with flickering firelight, it's easy to understand why. Even now, if you close your eyes a little, you might imagine yourself there, wrapped beneath a patched quilt, listening to the hushed breath of sleeping travelers, drifting into a dream you know will be discussed in the morning. Medieval nights had a softness we rarely let ourselves feel today. And before we drift into part 7 later, what dream do you think you would have had sleeping in a medieval inn? Tell me softly in the comments. I'd love to hear. Let's drift back into the candlelit quiet of the medieval world, settling again into that soft haze of worn timber, warm ale, and the kind of royal decision-making that suggests no one important had slept well since the Norman conquest. Tonight, we ease our way from the damp corners of the common tavern toward the grand, often drafty halls of the people who technically ran the place, or at least claimed they did whenever they weren't arguing over whose cousin had accidentally married their other cousin. As always, nothing here is urgent. Everything unfolds slowly, like a spilled sack of barley rolling across uneven floorboards. We'll ease into a new royal mess, one of those quiet, predictable ones that nevertheless shaped medieval life in small, irritating ways. And since you're already cozy, maybe sinking deeper into your pillow, we'll float gently toward the next chapter of strange habits, muddled thinking, and noble incompetence that governed the world from behind thick stone walls. You may remember how taverns served as the unofficial notice boards of the Middle Ages. Rumors traveled faster than royal messengers. And what spilled from those long tables and smoke-filled rafters often reflected the decisions made miles away in drafty chambers where kings, queens, and advisors performed the eternal tradition of running a kingdom the way one might run a runaway cart, meaning mostly by hoping gravity didn't win too quickly. So let's drift toward one of those courts now, continuing our meandering, sleepy stroll through what life might have been like when ordinary people, quite sensibly, drank heavily to cope. Tonight we visit Henry III of England, who reigned for more than half a century, much of it spent doing what he did best, being harmlessly incompetent in a way that exhausted everyone but rarely hurt anyone directly. His nobles routinely sighed themselves into early graves. His treasury developed a personality disorder from the constant demands. And Henry himself floated through the whole affair with the mild confusion of someone who woke up each morning startled to find himself still king. Henry was a dreamer, meaning he preferred religious architecture to warfare, prayer to politics, and spending to everything else. His court was filled with quiet disasters, none explosive, just an endless drizzle of decisions that nudged England into mild irritation. Picture him wandering Westminster like a gentle ghost, pausing every few feet to admire a stone carving, murmuring something about increasing the decoration budget again. Naturally, he didn't have the money. Naturally, he made it worse by trying anyway. And because medieval kings were legally allowed to treat taxes like a random creative challenge, Henry began imposing new ones with the logic of someone guessing at dice. He taxed wool. He taxed imported wine. He taxed nobles who dared to question him. He created fees for the right to avoid other fees, which seems innovative until you realize it angered everyone except himself. You can imagine the tavern-goers, farmers hunched over their ale, merchants whispering behind their hands, muttering about each new decree. The tavern was often the first place to hear that the king wanted another levy, or another loan, or had accidentally promised some relative land that technically belonged to the crown. These conversations were whispered softly, because complaining too loudly could earn you a fine, or worse, attention. But whispering was practically a medieval sport. Henry's greatest love, beyond taxes and elaborate church decorations, was Street Edward the Confessor, whose shrine he renovated so obsessively that even the monks wondered if he was compensating for something. The king adored the saint, visited his tomb often, and spent more money on the shrine than on half his military campaigns combined. Which perhaps explains why those campaigns didn't go terribly well. But Henry didn't seem bothered. He often seemed unaware war was even happening. His nobles, many with more energy and ambition than the king, kept trying to fix his policies, gently at first, and then with increasing desperation. They proposed reforms, plans, written agreements. Henry smiled, nodded, forgot what he agreed to, and returned to designing new mosaics. And so England drifted into one of those long, slow political crises where everyone involved pretended it was fine, much like a family dinner where one relative insists the turkey is undercooked while everyone else quietly chews. Somewhere in the messy middle of Henry's reign, travelers stopping at a local tavern would start hearing about Simon de Montfort, the king's brother-in-law, who gradually transformed from a loyal noble to a very annoyed one. You can picture the conversations over cheap ale. And now Simon says the king promised him money, didn't give it, and then blamed the treasury, which is funny because it was empty last year too. The listeners would nod, sip, shrug. It was all very familiar. Royal finances were the weather of medieval politics, always there, rarely good, and impossible to fix. Henry wasn't malicious. That's important to remember. He just didn't possess the sort of mind that carefully balanced state budgets or managed barons with firm diplomacy. Instead, he floated through crises like a pleasant cloud, convinced everything would sort itself out if he simply prayed enough and commissioned one more religious statue. And somehow, for a time, it worked. But of course, nothing in medieval governance stays calm forever. Eventually Simon de Montfort helped force Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, a set of reforms that basically said, "Please stop ruling like an unsupervised apprentice." Henry signed them reluctantly, almost certainly without reading them, and later ignored them completely. Which was, admittedly, on brand. And naturally, ignoring them made things worse. This all culminated in a civil conflict known as the Second Barons' War, although war is a generous word. It felt more like a prolonged argument conducted by people who couldn't remember what started it. The common folk, listening for updates in their taverns, mostly wanted the whole thing over quickly so they could go back to worrying about weather and grain prices instead of which noble was angry this week. Let's drift away from Henry now, because even thinking about his indecisiveness is enough to make a person want a nap. Instead, we'll drift toward another medieval figure whose personal habits were both memorable and mildly concerning: Charles VI of France. Charles, unfortunately for everyone, inherited a fragile mind and an unstable kingdom. His reign was a long, sad example of what happened when royal mental illness was treated by people whose most advanced medical tool was a bowl of herbs and a guess. Charles began with promise, young, handsome, perfectly normal. But early in his reign he suffered a sudden psychotic episode, attacking his own men under the belief they were plotting against him. Afterward, he deteriorated slowly, like a candle left in the sun. His episodes came and went unpredictably. Sometimes he forgot his own name. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and refused to be touched. Sometimes he ran through the palace screaming. And sometimes he was lucid, issuing royal commands as though nothing had happened. Imagine the quiet tension among his attendants, who never knew which Charles would emerge each morning. And imagine the taverns, too, humming with anxious gossip. The king won't let anyone near him. Says he'll shatter. They say he hasn't recognized the queen in weeks. The common people rarely met their monarch, but they felt the effects of his condition in shifting taxes, shifting alliances, and the quiet dread of living in a kingdom whose ruler might lose himself at any moment. The court physicians, who had approximately the same training as a modern gardener, tried everything from bloodletting to potions to prayer. Naturally, they made it worse. They always did. If you've ever wondered why medieval people drank so much wine, remember that clean water was rare and politics were exhausting. Charles VI's wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, bore the brunt of managing the kingdom in his stead. She became unpopular, not because she was terrible, but because the French nobility desperately needed someone to blame, and she was right there. Accusations about her overspending and alleged affairs filled the taverns, each rumor more dramatic than the last. Every time Charles disappeared into another episode, fresh stories sprouted up like weeds. Let's drift softly from France now and back toward England, where another royal oddity was quietly unfolding. This time it's Richard II, whose personality combined theatrical flair with the brittle temperament of someone who believed the universe revolved around him because, technically, it kind of did. Richard's sense of royal dignity bordered on delusion. He insisted on elaborate rituals and grand displays of power, and when criticized, he reacted with the weary indignation of someone judging a contest no one else entered. He loved expensive clothes, elaborate banquets, and symbolic gestures, things that made his nobles mutter into their goblets. His reign was one long fashion show in the middle of a political desert. And while the common folk struggled with famine, disease, and the occasional poorly planned tax, Richard was commissioning new robes threaded with gold because modesty simply wasn't his style. The disconnect between king and kingdom is a timeless theme. And in taverns across England, travelers shook their heads and whispered, "He's bought new curtains again, haven't he?" Curtains were not the problem, of course. The problem was that Richard often ruled through favoritism and resentment rather than practical governance. Eventually, his nobles rebelled. They cornered him politically, forced reforms, and briefly controlled the kingdom. Richard, naturally, hated this. He nursed every slight for years, like a cat holding a grudge about bath time. And when he regained power, he punished anyone who had dared undermine him. Softly, methodically, and with the kind of determination one usually sees in toddlers guarding a toy. But even Richard wasn't the most puzzling monarch England ever endured. For that, we drift gently into the reign of King John. Yes, that King John, the one who annoyed literally everyone to such an extent that his nobles forced the Magna Carta on him just to stop the constant tide of irritation. John was not dramatically evil. He wasn't a tyrant. He was simply petty, suspicious, greedy, and unlucky, which is a combination guaranteed to ruin any social gathering, let alone a kingdom. He taxed everything he could. He lost key territories in France. He fought with the church until England was placed under interdict, meaning church bells stopped ringing, weddings paused, funerals stalled, and taverns filled with worried speculations. And at one point John apparently tried to extort money from people by threatening to hang their relatives. Even medieval standards found this distasteful, which says a lot. John also had the charisma of a mildew stain. Even his supporters privately admitted he wasn't inspiring. And you can picture travelers trading eye rolls in taverns whenever his name came up. Ah yes, the king who lost Normandy but kept every single tax. Let's drift a little deeper now, past kings and councils, toward the personal quirks that made medieval elites not just powerful, but interestingly dysfunctional. Many nobles believed bathing too often weakened the body. Others insisted garlic cured every illness. One German duke reportedly slept on a bed of hay for spiritual discipline, which probably didn't impress his guests. Royal families, despite their luxuries, lived surrounded by superstition and self-inflicted discomfort. Consider the medieval habit of traveling with enormous entourages, sometimes hundreds of retainers, because nobles feared being poisoned at inns or robbed on the road. Taverns were respected enough to stay in, but not trusted enough to stay in alone. So travelers arrived with dozens of servants, horses, wagons, cooks, bedding, and guards, each needing food and space. Imagine the tavern keeper's face when 200 hungry men demanded dinner. And he had to pretend this was fine. Taverns heaved under the weight of these visiting entourages. Beds were stuffed with hay, replaced too rarely. Sheets were sometimes washed, though not often enough. Fleas and lice made themselves comfortable. The smell, undoubtedly, was unforgettable. And yet nobles insisted on complaining about the quality. One can almost hear them, "This straw is too crunchy, innkeeper," as though straw had a softer option. Still, taverns were often the most comfortable place common people ever visited. A fire, warm food, conversation, ale. It was a temporary escape from fields and chores. And these moments of quiet comfort echoed across centuries, preserved in diaries, letters, and the faint archaeology of soot-stained hearths. Before we drift to the end of this part, take a moment. Imagine yourself in a medieval tavern now, timbers creaking, cups clinking, the low hum of travelers sharing news. Maybe you'd fit right in, listening to the latest royal misadventure with a raised eyebrow. Maybe you'd ask the people beside you, "So, what would you have done if you lived under King Henry?" It's a good question to leave in the comments, if you feel like sharing. Let's let that thought linger, because why not? Tell me below, which medieval monarch we've drifted through tonight would frustrate you the most, and why? Let's settle back down into that gentle, drifting rhythm again. You can let your shoulders loosen a little as we ease further into the soft candle glow of medieval life, where nothing ever moved quickly except disease, taxes, and the occasional irritated goose. Everything else, especially royal decision-making, flowed at the pace of a sleepy river, winding its way through generations of people who mostly wanted to get by without attracting attention. Tonight, we'll sink into that slow current and follow it right into the next softly absurd stretch of medieval history. We're drifting now from taverns and kings into the small, strange, unnoticed corners of life, those quiet habits, quirks, and moments that shaped people's days far more than the battles that modern textbooks love so much. And as always, we'll keep our tone soft, our pace steady, and our humor dry enough to preserve fish. Last time, we brushed against the royals who steered their kingdoms with the same confidence as someone carrying a full bucket of water across uneven ground, determined but constantly spilling. Now let's drift toward the people who lived just outside that royal orbit, the minor nobles, courtiers, knights, and clergy who orbited power like small, confused moons. Their daily lives were filled with rituals, discomforts, and duties that sound dramatic on paper but were usually mind-numbingly repetitive in practice. Think, for example, about the medieval knight, not the heroic figure from films, charging with a dramatic roar, but the real one. The one who spent most of his life managing estates, supervising harvests, quarreling with neighbors about grazing rights, and trying not to get gout again. The kind of knight who couldn't always afford a warhorse, who reused armor passed down through 3 generations, and who trained for combat mostly by hitting things in the yard while muttering about taxes. The truth is that most medieval knights preferred peace. War was expensive, armor was heavy, and dying was inconvenient. But when nobles or kings decided on military campaigns, knights had to pack up their gear, kiss their families goodbye, and march off towards someone else's political mistake. They traveled for weeks, slept outdoors, caught colds, and occasionally questioned whether chivalry was really worth it or if the troubadours had simply oversold it again. And when knights stopped at taverns during long journeys, the tavern became a stage. You'd find knights drinking beside merchants, monks, and traveling peddlers, all of them silently trying to pretend they didn't smell as badly as everyone else. Knights enjoyed the break, of course, but they also tended to recount battlefield stories in a tone of weary resignation. Less, "I fought heroically," more, "My horse stepped in a ditch and I sprained my back again." It's the sort of honesty you only share over warm ale and a shaky stool. Let's drift from the knight to someone even more present in medieval life, the clergy. Priests, monks, nuns, friars, a whole world within a world. The church was enormous, powerful, and woven into every moment of daily existence. But beneath the grand architecture and solemn rituals were people, ordinary people, trying to navigate rules and expectations that often seemed designed by someone who enjoyed watching others struggle. Monks rose before dawn, stumbling through cold hallways to chant morning prayers in voices that were probably more groans than hymns. They copied manuscripts in chilly rooms where ink froze in winter. They tended gardens, brewed beer, and attempted spiritual contemplation while also dealing with the fact that someone always snored loudly in the dormitory. A monk's life sounded peaceful, but in reality it was a collection of daily irritations wrapped in a blanket of discipline. Nuns lived similarly structured lives, though they often managed their own estates and financial affairs with a competence that put many nobles to shame. Some abbesses were powerful landowners, respected scholars, or forceful administrators who negotiated with kings more effectively than half the court. But even they dealt with everyday burdens, roof leaks, sick animals, unruly novices, and the constant struggle to find enough candles for the winter months. And everywhere, in every town, every village, you'd find parish priests, men who balanced spiritual duties with the mundane realities of repairing church buildings, collecting tithes, and soothing local quarrels. Priests were mediators, counselors, accountants, and occasionally referees. They baptized babies, heard confessions, tended the sick, and fielded complaints from villagers who felt their neighbors' chickens were trespassing spiritually as well as physically. But for all their responsibilities, priests were also human. Some were scholarly, some were deeply pious, some were lazy, fond of ale, or chronically confused by their own paperwork. And taverns, yes, those again, served as their informal offices. People cornered them with questions. Is my cow cursed, father? Is it sinful to skip fasting when the fish tastes like mud? If my husband snores during evening prayer, is that a sign from the saints? Priests handled these inquiries with practiced patience, which is perhaps the greatest miracle of all. Let's drift a bit further outward now into the daily life of the average medieval villager. Not the dramatic events, not the plagues or wars, but the simple things, how they cooked, worked, traveled, and entertained themselves in the quiet hours when the fields were done and the animals fed. Meals were small, repetitive, and not nearly as terrible as some stories suggest. Bread, pottage, vegetables, ale, simple, filling, and familiar. Meat was rarer, but not unknown. Sundays felt special because they were the one day many people tasted something roasted. Families huddled around hearths that smoked more often than they warmed, sharing whatever they had with a practicality that modern kitchens rarely demand. Children had chores from the moment they could walk, and their toys were usually repurposed household items. A stick, a carved wooden animal, a piece of cloth, they made do, happily most days. And on festival days, when the village erupted into dancing, games, and the kind of joy that comes only after months of predictable work, children ran wild through the crowds while adults drank, laughed, and occasionally challenged each other to mildly regrettable competitions. Travel, for most villagers, was rare. A journey of 10 miles could be an event worth discussing for months. People walked dusty roads lined with hedges, watched by birds, dogs, and occasionally suspicious goats. Travelers sought shelter in taverns not because they wanted to, but because they needed to. Inns were often expensive, so villagers sometimes slept in barns or beneath wagons, which wasn't pleasant but was at least free. And always, gossip traveled with them. Word of a distant scandal, a noble feud, a royal decree. These bits of news floated from one settlement to the next, passed along so casually that by the time they reached the other side of the kingdom, they barely resembled the truth. But medieval people didn't care. News was entertainment as much as information. Let's drift now toward another corner of medieval life people often forget, the market. Markets were loud, chaotic, colorful, and surprisingly full of rules. Officials weighed goods to prevent cheating. Bakers were inspected. Butchers were monitored. And market criers shouted announcements that no one fully listened to. Chickens escaped regularly, prompting brief chases. Farmers haggled over grain prices. And then there were entertainers, jugglers, musicians, storytellers, performing loudly enough to gather coins and gently annoy everyone else. Markets also revealed something important. Medieval people weren't as isolated as we imagine. They traded widely. They bargained. They argued. They learned news. They met travelers. They saw new faces. And after returning home, they told stories of everything they'd witnessed, usually embellishing them just enough to make the evening's ale taste better. From markets, we drift into the quieter, stranger realm of medieval medicine. A realm of herbs, prayers, and treatments that ranged from surprisingly effective to impressively misguided. A headache might be treated with lavender, mint, or willow bark, which contains the active ingredient in aspirin. Not bad. But other treatments relied on astrology, bloodletting, or the belief that illness resulted from an imbalance of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you don't know what those are, consider yourself blessed. Doctors believed nearly everything influenced health. The weather, the stars, the season, your personality, your diet, your dreams, your neighbor's dreams, and possibly the chicken you walked past last Tuesday. Physicians studied for years, but their tools were limited. Barbers performed surgery. Monks copied medical texts full of both brilliant observations and spectacularly incorrect guesses. And patients mostly survived because the human body, stubbornly, tries very hard to live. Let's float from medicine toward one of the most overlooked groups in medieval society: widows. They appear quietly in documents, often managing estates or running businesses. Unlike today, medieval widows could hold property, sue in court, hire laborers, and make contracts. Some wielded more economic power than many men of their class. They appear in tavern records as owners, customers, creditors, and sometimes as the people who settled disputes after the men involved drank too much. A widow who inherited land or a workshop could become a respected figure in her community. Some ran vineyards, mills, dye works, or breweries. And though many remarried quickly, practicality often demanded it, others remained independent for decades. Medieval life was not always kind, but it left surprising pockets of autonomy, especially for women who refused to vanish quietly. As we drift toward the end of this part, let's circle back to that medieval tavern, the anchor of our wandering journey. Imagine it again now. The fire crackles softly, throwing long shadows. Travelers settle in at heavy tables. Someone begins a quiet song in the corner. A monk warms his hands. A knight massages his sore shoulders. A merchant counts coins beneath his breath. Outside, night settles over the village like a wool cloak. If you stepped inside, what would you do first? Would you order ale? Listen for gossip? Ask the travelers where they'd come from? It's the kind of thing you can share in the comments if you feel like it. No pressure, of course. And as part 8 settles into silence, here's your gentle engagement question. If you could visit one corner of medieval daily life, tavern, market, manor, monastery, where would you go first, and why? Let's ease ourselves back into the dimly lit medieval world, like stepping once more into a room warmed by a slow-burning hearth. The kind of heat that's gentle rather than dramatic, radiating outward in soft pulses, perfect for this sort of slow, sleep-bound wandering. As we drift into part 9, imagine the night outside deepening, stars settling comfortably into their places, and the last sounds of the village fading into that familiar, rustic quiet. We'll continue our soft journey through medieval life, its oddities, its routines, and its endless parade of characters who often took themselves far more seriously than circumstances justified. Tonight, we drift toward the misunderstood world of medieval food and feasting, not the exaggerated banquets for movies, but the real rhythms of eating, cooking, and hosting. Food was both necessity and spectacle. It was where social class showed itself most clearly, and it was where medieval people revealed their best habits, worst habits, and occasionally their most baffling decisions. Picture a medieval feast. The kind where nobles gathered at long wooden tables, covered not with tablecloths but with trenchers, thick slabs of day-old bread, sturdy enough to function as plates. These trenchers soaked up meat juices, sauces, and whatever else spilled during the meal. Later, they were given to the poor, because when bread can double as tableware, nothing goes to waste. Feasts were loud, messy, and surprisingly slow. Servants moved about constantly, refilling cups, carving meats, carrying platters. Dogs roamed freely under the tables, hoping for dropped scraps. Nobles talked, argued, flirted, and occasionally dozed, especially through the more tedious ceremonial toasts. The food, though plentiful, wasn't always warm by the time it reached everyone. Imagine a large roasted bird making its way down a table 20 meters long. By the halfway point, it was less roast and more culinary afterthought. But despite all that, feasts mattered. They were displays of wealth and power, even when the food itself was questionable. For example, medieval cooks adored spices, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, not for flavor alone, but because spices were expensive. A dish overloaded with spices screamed, "I am wealthy enough to waste half a year's salary on this stew, and you are going to eat it and admire me." It's basically the medieval equivalent of someone loudly mentioning their luxury car for the 3rd time in a conversation. Then there were the more theatrical foods, peacocks served with their feathers reattached, gilded pastries, towers of marzipan, or the infamous cockentrice, a chimera-like dish combining the front half of a pig with the back half of a chicken, stitched together and roasted. No one asked for this. No one needed this. Yet it appeared because medieval nobility loved anything that made guests blink twice in confusion. And while nobles feasted noticeably and loudly, the average medieval villager ate quietly and repetitively. For them, meals were less about spectacle and more about survival. Breakfast was usually whatever leftovers existed. Lunch might be pottage, a thick, stewed mixture of grains, vegetables, herbs, and sometimes beans. Dinner was often another bowl of pottage, but perhaps with a slightly different herb added to pretend variety existed. Think of it as the medieval version of "we have food at home," repeated daily for centuries. Yet villagers weren't joyless about food. They flavored things with herbs they grew themselves, celebrated when a chicken laid more eggs than expected, and eagerly awaited seasonal treats. Fresh berries in summer, roasted chestnuts in autumn, a little salted pork in winter. Even during difficult years, people found ways to make meals comforting. Humans, after all, are very good at discovering small happiness in large hardship. Let's drift from the table to the kitchen, the real engine of medieval life. Kitchens in noble households were bustling, smoky, and noisy. Apprentices chopped vegetables. Cooks stirred enormous cauldrons. Scullions scrubbed pots roughly the size of bathtubs. Fires burned constantly, sometimes erupting into dramatic bursts that singed eyebrows and startled the cooks. Bread baked in great stone ovens, fish sizzled on grills, and soups bubbled relentlessly. In smaller homes, the kitchen was simply the hearth. A single pot, a single pan, a few wooden utensils, and a set of hands that knew every trick to stretch limited ingredients into something edible. Families gathered around these hearths not only for meals, but for warmth, conversation, and the faint hope that the smoke might eventually leave through the vent instead of lingering in the room like an uninvited guest. Kitchens were also where stories were shared. Gossip, rumors, complaints about weather, taxes, neighbors, livestock, everything passed through the kitchen first. It was essentially the medieval version of social media, but with more onions and fewer questionable conspiracy theories. Now, let's drift toward medieval servants, the invisible engines of noble households. Their lives were demanding, repetitive, and often exhausting. They scrubbed floors, washed fabrics, carried water, chopped wood, maintained fires, saddled horses, polished armor, and answered to masters who often behaved as if towels materialized out of thin air. Servants woke before dawn and worked long after sunset. They lived close enough to nobility to observe their daily dramas, but far enough away to never interfere. Despite their workload, many servants found small pleasures in the routine, sharing jokes with each other, sneaking an extra scrap of food from the kitchen, or talking quietly while doing evening chores. Some rose through the ranks, others stayed in the same position for decades. Their stability made households function. It's funny, when we read history, we hear about the lords, but it's the servants who kept things from collapsing daily. Let's ease toward medieval fashion now, a topic that reveals more about people than they intended. Clothing wasn't just practical. It was a quiet language of status, wealth, and identity. Nobles wore fine wool, silk, damask, brocade, anything that signaled superiority. They favored bright colors because dyes were expensive. Red, for example, often indicated wealth or importance. Unless, of course, it was worn by someone who simply wanted to irritate their rivals. That happened more often than you'd think. Lower-class clothing was simpler. Wool, linen, earth tones. Functional and warm. And while many imagine medieval clothing as uniformly drab, villagers appreciated color whenever they could afford it. A blue hood here, a red belt there. Small splashes of brightness in a world ruled by practicality. And then we have the strange fashion choices. Polanes, those absurdly long pointed shoes worn by nobles, excessively tight sleeves, codpieces that grew more exaggerated with each passing decade. Some medieval styles prove that people have always been capable of astonishingly bad decisions when trying to signal status. Let's drift toward another quiet but important part of medieval life, lighting. After sunset, the medieval world dimmed dramatically. Homes relied on tallow candles, oil lamps, or simple torches. The smoky glow gave interiors a warm, hazy quality, but it also meant everything smelled faintly of animal fat and soot. People went to bed early, partly because they were tired, but also because staying up late required a budget for candles. It's hard to stay awake reading when your entire nightlight drips onto your hand and smells like a wet barnyard. Nobles, with more resources, illuminated their halls with chandeliers and dozens of candles. But even then, the lighting was soft. Never the bright, electric glow we know today. Instead, rooms shimmered with an uneven, flickering atmosphere that made everything look both magical and slightly sinister. It's no wonder medieval people believed in ghosts. Try walking through a drafty stone corridor lit by a single candle and see what your imagination does. Let's wander now toward medieval entertainment. Contrary to popular belief, people weren't dull or joyless. They loved music, dancing, storytelling, and games. They played dice, chess, and early card games. They listened to minstrels who sang stories of heroes, saints, and occasionally scandalous court gossip thinly disguised as educational material. During festivals, villages became whirlwinds of noise, color, and energy, dancing around maypoles, competing in contests, and feasting on whatever food the community contributed. Evenings at home involved simpler joys, singing together, playing small instruments, embroidering, telling bedtime stories, or simply talking by the fire. Life was difficult, but people found ways to soften the edges. Humans always do. Before we drift too far, let's gently step into the world of medieval hygiene, an area where myth and reality are often confused. Contrary to the stereotype, medieval people did wash, and many washed regularly. Baths were common in several cities, though not always affordable. People washed hands before meals, and laundering clothes, especially underclothes, was part of routine household work. Of course, deodorant hadn't been invented, so the average scent was earthy. But considering the labor-intensive nature of their lives, it's impressive they managed as much hygiene as they did. Still, there were challenges. Soap was expensive. Water didn't magically heat itself. Bathhouses sometimes doubled as social venues, which made them convenient but occasionally questionable. And people's understanding of germs was, well, non-existent. They believed illness traveled through miasma, bad air. So many hygiene attempts focused on pleasant smells rather than actual cleanliness. Let's drift slowly toward medieval travel. Roads were rough, journeys long, and carriages uncomfortable. Most people walked. Those who rode did so on horses that didn't particularly enjoy the experience. Travelers carried food, water, and a healthy amount of caution. Taverns provided shelter, but prices varied, and beds were questionable. Many travelers preferred to sleep near their horses or inside barns, which, ironically, often smelled better than some inns. Travel was tiring but essential. Pilgrims walked for months. Merchants carried goods across kingdoms. Messengers delivered royal orders across muddy terrain. And while danger existed, so did the sense of adventure. New sights, new people, new stories to bring home and embellish endlessly. As we approach the end of Part 9, let's settle back into that warm, familiar medieval tavern we keep returning to, because it feels like the natural resting point of all these wandering paths. Imagine the fire glowing softly, casting an orange glow on rough wooden beams. Travelers sip ale slowly. A tired cook wipes down a counter. Someone hums a tune nearby. The night outside deepens, but inside, the world is gentle. Here's your engagement question for this part, whispered in a tone soft enough for bedtime. If you had to choose one medieval role, cook, minstrel, merchant, knight, or innkeeper, which would you be, and why? Feel free to share your answer in the comments when you're awake enough. Let's drift one last time into the dim, flickering glow of the medieval world, where the torches burned low, the nobles complained loudly, and the common folk simply got on with things because, frankly, they had no other choice. Tonight, we're wandering into the quieter corners of that world, into the places people rarely talk about in history books, probably because the scribes dozed off halfway through writing about them. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let the night settle around you. This final stretch is meant to be soft, gentle, and just a little bit ridiculous, because history, like life, tends to wander off in its own sleepy direction. We'll begin with one of the least glamorous but most relied upon figures in the medieval world, the physician. Or rather, the person who called himself a physician while possessing the practical medical skill of a mildly attentive chicken. Medieval physicians were a fascinating group. They wore long robes, carried important-looking books, and talked endlessly about humors, those four bodily fluids that supposedly determined every aspect of your health, personality, and possibly the alignment of your furniture. According to them, if you felt dizzy, it was probably your phlegm acting up. If you were sad, your black bile was probably hosting a small rebellion. If you had a headache, someone would confidently announce that your blood was being dramatic again. Despite the certainty of their diagnoses, medieval doctors rarely helped anyone. Their favorite solution to almost everything was bloodletting, which involved removing some of your blood in the hopes that your body would simply reset, like a medieval version of turning a device off and on again. Naturally, this did not usually help, but it did make the patient very quiet for a while, which the physician may have mistaken for recovery. And yet, people trusted them, perhaps because the alternatives were even worse. There were also the so-called barber surgeons, who gave you a haircut and then, if you insisted, removed a limb. Imagine going in for a trim and leaving without a foot. Their shops advertised services using a striped pole, symbolizing the bandages they washed in basins of blood. Yes, that famous barber pole outside modern shops has a surprisingly grim origin. If you ever feel the urge to mention this at a dinner party, you might want to pick your audience carefully. Some people don't enjoy hearing about medieval blood basins over dessert. Still, the barber surgeons did know how to sew things, which was helpful when parts of you needed putting back together. Medieval surgeons often stitched wounds with techniques inspired by sewing tunics or mending bags of grain. And while that sounds questionable, they occasionally succeeded. Other times, well, the patient didn't make it, but the stitches looked very neat, which mattered a surprising amount to some chroniclers. If you've ever had a slightly overconfident friend who insists they know how to fix something because they saw it once, that feeling captures much of medieval medicine. Let's wander away from the physicians and into the soft haze of medieval domestic life, where everything moved at a slow, deliberate pace, mostly because the world lacked caffeine in its familiar, convenient form. People did drink weak ale all day, which technically had some energizing effect, but it also had the side effect of making everyone slightly confused at all times. It was not the most productive era. Yet people managed. Inside a medieval home, assuming it belonged to an ordinary family rather than nobility, you'd find a single large room serving every purpose imaginable. Cooking, sleeping, repairing tools, storing food, avoiding drafts, it all happened in the same smoky, low-ceiling space. Families slept on simple pallets stuffed with straw. Every so often, the straw was replaced, mainly when it became more straw-adjacent than straw-containing. Guests sometimes shared the same sleeping space, including the family's animals. There's nothing quite like falling asleep next to a cow to truly embrace medieval authenticity. But even in wealthier homes, comfort was limited. Nobles slept on high wooden beds meant to keep them above the drafts, which was an admirable effort, though the drafts tended to sneak in anyway because medieval architecture liked to pretend it understood insulation. Curtains helped a little. So did piling on so many blankets that getting out of bed required a strategic plan. Some nobles slept sitting up because they believed lying flat resembled the posture of death, which felt like tempting fate. Whether this helped them avoid illness or simply gave them terrible posture is unclear. And yet, there's something endearing in how universal the human experience of bedtime is, even across the centuries. People wanted warmth, comfort, and a little sense of safety. They told stories by candlelight, gossiped, ate small snacks when they could find them, and complained about the weather, because of course they did. Complaining about weather is a timeless human tradition. Let's drift toward another figure of medieval life, the wandering minstrel. These musicians traveled from town to town, playing songs for food, shelter, or the occasional coin. Their instruments were simple: harps, flutes, drums, lutes, and their repertoire ranged from heroic ballads to mildly scandalous tavern songs. Minstrels served as living newspapers, carrying stories and rumors across the countryside. They were the closest thing to social media the medieval world had, though perhaps a bit slower and less prone to arguments about politics in the comment section. But minstrels also had to be careful. Telling the wrong joke about the wrong noble could end their career abruptly. So they learned to make their commentary subtle, weaving humor into their songs like threads through cloth. A clever minstrel could insult an entire region without anyone realizing it until hours later. Some of them were masters of passive-aggressive storytelling, which might explain why nobles sometimes commissioned private performances, just to make sure the wandering musician wasn't spreading rumors about how poorly their last banquet went. Alongside them were the jesters, those brightly clothed figures employed by nobility to provide entertainment, distraction, and occasionally, social commentary disguised as foolishness. A jester's job was both playful and precarious. They had permission to poke fun at the powerful, but only within a vague, invisible line that could shift at any moment. A wise jester knew exactly how to make a king laugh without making him question his dignity. Some jesters were surprisingly influential, whispering advice in the ears of rulers who valued honesty wrapped in humor. Others were, unfortunately, not very good at their jobs. Their careers tended to be short. Very short. But the role of entertainment was essential in a world where life could be slow, repetitive, and filled with obligations. People needed distractions. They needed stories, laughter, music, and the occasional absurd performance to break the monotony. It's comforting, in a way, to realize that humans have always sought the familiar blend of joy and escape, whether through a lute, a poem, or a YouTube history video slowly lulling them towards sleep. Let's wander gently now into one more aspect of medieval life: travel. Not the heroic, dragon-slaying journeys of legend, but the actual, practical experience of traveling anywhere in the medieval world. Spoiler: it was slow. Painfully slow. If you've ever complained about being stuck in traffic for 20 minutes, imagine traveling 30 miles over the course of 2 days, on a road so muddy it could swallow a horse up to its knees. Medieval travel required patience, endurance, and a tolerance for uncertainty. Weather shifted. Roads vanished. Inns, when they existed, were often full. And if you weren't lucky enough to find one, you simply stopped where you were and hoped the local wildlife wasn't feeling ambitious that night. But people still traveled, for trade, for pilgrimage, for family obligations, or simply because life required it. Pilgrimages were especially common. A medieval pilgrim walking hundreds of miles to a distant shrine wasn't unusual. They traveled with badges, charms, and walking staffs, forming long, winding lines along the countryside. Pilgrimages blended devotion, curiosity, and social opportunity. Even then, people enjoyed meeting travelers from faraway places, sharing stories, and discovering that someone 5 villages over had the same complaints about taxes. If you ever feel like your own travel days are exhausting, medieval pilgrims might tell you, gently of course, that at least you don't have to worry about wolves. As we drift through these last soft minutes of our medieval journey, let's take one more quiet step into the world of medieval belief. Superstitions shaped everyday decisions, from choosing where to build a house to deciding which herbs to hang above the door. People believed in spirits, omens, signs in the sky, and dreams that held hidden messages. Many of these beliefs made life feel less uncertain, offering explanations for the inexplicable. Others were less helpful. For example, if your crops failed, it was obviously because someone looked at them with envy. Naturally. But people also found comfort in rituals. Lighting a candle, whispering a prayer, carrying a charm, these were small acts of hope in a world full of unpredictability. And in a way, they weren't so different from the small rituals we carry today. A favorite mug, a lucky pen, a bedtime routine that helps us settle our thoughts. The world changes. People don't. Not really. We've reached the last stretch now, the final soft glow of this long, drowsy journey through medieval life. You've walked through taverns and castles, wandered past fields and markets, met royals, peasants, monks, minstrels, physicians, and the occasional overly ambitious chicken. You've seen how life unfolded at a gentle, unhurried pace, full of strangeness, humor, hardship, and surprising warmth. Maybe you learned something new. Maybe you're already halfway asleep. Either result is a success in my book. Before we close, I'll leave you with one more drifting question, as is tradition throughout this series. If you lived in the medieval world, which part of it would you want to explore? And which part would you carefully avoid? Let me know in the comments, once you're awake, of course. And now, slowly, softly, let's bring this long journey to a close. Thank you for spending your night here, wandering through old stories with me. If you enjoyed drifting through history in this calm little corner of YouTube, feel free to leave a like, share the video with someone who needs a quiet escape, or subscribe for more sleepy wanderings through time. Your support genuinely helps keep these peaceful journeys going. For now, rest well, breathe deeply, and let the weight of the day slip away. Good night, friends. Crescent Moon.